Welcome to the lecture for Psych 350. We're talking about the cognitive approach to understanding personality. Start off just by looking at some basic assumptions, overarching assumptions behind the cognitive approach. One is that individuals process information differently, right? And so, what do we mean by process information? What is information processing? Well, it entails several different processes or functions, but some of the important ones are attention, so the things that you notice. So if there are individual differences in how we process information, then people pay attention to different things. You go to a party and maybe you'll notice, oh, look, they have Cheetos. I love Cheetos. And somebody else goes and oh, this music, I love this music. Somebody else goes and go, oh, really? That couch with those drapes, that doesn't match at all. Right? So people will attend, they'll notice different things. Right? It's one aspect of information processing. Another will be meaning, how you relate the information that you gather by noticing stuff, the information you attend to, what meaning you ascribe to it, how you relate it to other information you already know, right? You've already encountered, differs, right? So maybe two people will both notice the song that's playing, and one will go, "Oh my gosh, that song that was playing when I went on my first date, so special memories." Somebody goes, "Oh God, that song, I remember that was playing when I broke up with someone the first time." So they pay attention to the same information, but they experience it differently because there's different meaning for each of them, because they think about it differently, because they have other information that relates to that differently. And then storage is another process, so how people store information, so kind of, and often we talk about depth of storage, so kind of at a surface level or more deeply, and the more deeply information is stored, the longer it will resist decay, so the longer you'll be able to recall that information, unlike maybe some of the material from this class, you may not, if you don't store it very deeply, if you just study right before a test or right before a quiz, and don't think very deeply about it, in a couple of weeks people ask you about personality theory, and you go, yeah, people have some theories, right? But if you think about it a lot, then years from now you go, oh well, I remember actually talking about reinforcement value and Rotter's ideas, so the stuff will be there, and then the last process we'll talk about would be people recall information differently, and they use different cues for recalling things. When you're trying to remember, a phone number, people have different strategies for. Some people, if I can pull out my phone and start dialing it, I can remember. Other people say, well, if I can just try to imagine what it looks like on my phone, on the numbers, or in my address book, I can picture those numbers, then I can remember. So we have different strategies for how they recall and access information. But overall, again, individuals differ in how they process information, right? And that's important because of the other assumption: how people process information affects how they behave, right? This seems simple, but it's big for personality, because that means that when we look at personality, how people act differently, well, they act differently because they are processing information differently, right? If we assume that first that they process information differently, and then that processing information, how you do that affects how you behave, which makes sense. If you notice the music and it's something you really like, your behavior will be one way. Somebody else who doesn't notice the music at all and sees, oh, they don't have any Cheetos, I'm out of here, they're going to leave, before they notice the great song that's on, right? So two different behaviors based on information processing. Okay, so people differ in how they process information, and how they process information affects how they behave. So differences in behavior are due to differences in information processing. Right? And then the last kind of big part as well. So you said people differ in how they process information. Why might that happen? Well, because experience influences how information is processed, right? So if people have different experiences, they'll process information differently, and then that will lead to different experiences, and then you have this kind of circular pattern that goes on, where how you think and what environment you create for yourself continue to interact to give rise to your unique personality, right? So your experience influences obviously what information is processed. If you go to a lot of parties, you're going to have information about parties. If you never go to a party, you won't have that information, right? So the types of information that you get depends on your experiences. If you experience a loss or a traumatic event, or you experience affection from other people, you'll think about the world differently than people that don't have those experiences, right? And theorists differ with regard to the exact role of the individual here in translating experience into information. But if we think back to Piaget's approach, which kind of undergirds a lot of stuff that cognitive psychologists use, he was a constructivist, right? The idea that we actively construct our own knowledge as kind of lay scientists. So something happens and we come up with a hypothesis for why or how it happened, and then we look for confirmatory or disconfirmatory information, and sometimes we'll even run experiments. You say, we run experiments? Yeah, even little kids run experiments, right? Little kids sitting at the high chair, and they drop their spoon and they go, "Ooh, that's an interesting sound that it made when it hit the floor," and the parent picks it up and they go, "Well, that was interesting." The parent picked it up. I wonder what will happen if I do it again. Right? That is an experiment. They're going to repeat the what they believe was some sort of causative agent. I'm going to drop the spoon. It's going to make a noise, and they're going to pick it up. Let's see if it happens, and they'll do it. And they may repeat the experiment several times if they're one of my children. But that's the idea that even sometimes when we're not actively doing it, that we're just built to create our own knowledge by coming up with these kind of tentative hypotheses and then looking to confirm or disconfirm them. Excuse me. And then related idea is that how we process information now affects how we'll process information later, right? So any knowledge or information that you come upon is always viewed through a lens that's been shaped by previous processing of information, right? So, so say you get mugged a second time. How you think about that, feel about that, will depend to a great extent on how you thought about it the first time, right? If if the first time you got mugged, did you think, this place is unsafe, or people are evil, or I'm just unlucky? Depending on that first interpretation, when it happens the second time, you're gonna think is going to be related to how you interpreted the first event, right? Okay. So let's get to what happens with all this thinking, all this cognition, right? So we're talking about the inside the black box, right? Because the classic behavioral view always talks about the stimulus-response connection. So something happens, and then there's a response, and somewhere in between is the organism, and the idea that there's kind of this black box between the stimulus and response, which kind of stands for as a metaphor for what happens within the organism. And for behaviorists, that's what happens inside that black box. What happens within the organism is thought to be unobservable and therefore unknowable, and so not relevant to scientific study of behavior. But this is where cognitive psychologists are like, no, that's the interesting stuff. Right? They want to figure out what's going on within individuals that may determine why sometimes the same stimulus leads to different responses, right? And it's not as simple as, well, we can see that they've had these other stimuli before. Sometimes we can't track all those things down. There's got to be something intervening between the stimulus and response, right? We are thinking sentient beings. And so the cognitive psychologists want to figure out, well, what are we thinking and how are we thinking? One of the big theorists in this field would be Kelly, right? Who came up with the personal construct theory. And for Kelly, kind of like Piaget, people are like scientists. They come up with hypotheses to explain events they experience in the world. And if future events are consistent with their hypotheses, then the hypotheses are strengthened. And if not, then the hypotheses are revised. So he's all about looking at, how do we deal with information that's presented by events in the world. He's come up with this idea of personal constructs. So a personal construct is just a cognitive structure. So it's not anything you can see or touch. It's a hypothetical idea, right? So the idea that there's this cognitive structure that we use to interpret and predict events. And for Kelly, I thought these were bipolar in nature, and not bipolar in terms of the DSM-4 diagnosis, bipolar disorder. Bipolar in terms of having two poles, right? So each personal construct has can be thought of as being kind of on one continuum with opposites of that continuum at either end, at either pole. So, some of these personal constructs might be, I'd look and see if people are friendly or unfriendly. So one end of the pole is friendly, the antipode would be unfriendly, or exciting versus boring. Right? And according to Kelly, there's no set list of personal constructs. Right? Each individual has different ones, and that's part of what makes us different and gives rise to personality. And personality is all about individual differences, remember? So we have these personal constructs that we use to make sense of information. So we encounter stimuli out in the world, and then we make some judgment about it, and using some combination of these personal constructs. So is it this or this? Okay, it's this, and is it this or this? Okay, so it's this, and is it this or this? Right? And based on that, we get these shades of gray, not just black and white, as you may think from a simple kind of bipolar approach. And beyond that, he said, not only do people have different constructs, different personal constructs, people might actually have different personal construct systems, right? And the personal construct system is just the way that you organize your personal constructs, which includes, the order in which the different personal constructs are applied. So, for example, a person might eat a meal and think about whether it was, it was tasty or it was gross. And then if tasty, they'll think about if it was expensive or cheap. But if it's gross, they don't think about if it's expensive or cheap. All they think it was gross. No more processing goes on, right? And that's how they organize their personal constructs for meals. Another person might eat the same meal, and they'll think about tasty or gross. But then they'll think about expensive or cheap either way. Oh, that was really expensive. Or I'm sorry, it was really tasty, but it was expensive. Or that was tasty and it was cheap. Or they'll think, oh, it was gross and it was expensive. Or oh, it was gross, but at least it was cheap. Taco Bell. And then a whole another person might think about cost first, and then before they think about taste. So think about cost and then think about taste. Or cost first and then only think about taste depending on what the cost was. Right? So there's all these different possible ways of processing the multitude of information that are presented by events in our world. And there's a further assumption here that your approach to processing information is stable across time. And that, again, gives rise to personality. Okay, so Kelly's idea of personal construct theory, is that we have all these different kind of lenses or templates that we look at the world and make decisions about. Is it this or this? And is it this or this? And it's some combination of those things make up information about any one event. Right? And the decisions we make in terms of is it this or this, which personal construct you use and the order in which you apply those are unique to you. Nobody else probably does it exactly the way you do it, and that is your individual personality. Right? Other theorists have kind of gone beyond Kelly's theory to consider other kind of black box variables that might moderate the relationship between stimulus and response. We talk about these other cognitive and affective, being kind of emotional influences. One of which would be encodings, which are constructs for encoding information. And so, Kelly's ideas about personal constructs would fall into this category. Personal constructs are encodings, right? So if you have a certain way of encoding information, I think that's boring or exciting, that's a construct. So ways of thinking about information to encode it. Encoding is just how you're thinking about information in order to put it into memory and work on it to process it. Expectations, right, which gets back to Rotter's ideas about expectancies a bit. In terms of how we expect things to be, if we expect them to be positive or negative. Affects, talking about emotional state, both physiological and subjective. That emotional state influences how information is processed, and some really interesting stuff about this. Looking at things like state-dependent memory. If you learn a list of words while you're in a sad mood, which experiments will manipulate your mood by showing you Schindler's List or some other sad movie, you learn a list of words, and then later it's easier to remember those words if you're in a sad mood again than if you're in a happy mood. Right? We have that mood congruent learning, state dependent memory, which is one of the things so we know that how you're feeling at a time affects how you're processing information in terms of encoding it. It also affects what information you can remember. Right? Whenever you're depressed, it's easier to remember negative things. It's easier to see the dark side of things. When you're in a really good mood, it's easier to see the silver lining. Right? It's easier to be optimistic when you're feeling good. Beyond that, goals and values, which also is related, getting back to Rotter's ideas about reinforcement values. So kind of what things are important to you will influence what you notice, what you think about, and how you store information. Skimming through a magazine, and there's a little headline, something about car seats. If you don't have kids, no big deal. You don't even notice it. Like it registered in your retina, but not significant, so your brain didn't tell you to look any deeper. If you have kids, you might go, "Oh, what's this about car seats? They changing the rules again?" Right? So you have information that's relevant already stored there, and so if you kind of value information related to child rearing, then you're going to spend more of your cognitive resources learning more about that stimulus that's out in the environment. And then the last one I'll mention briefly is competencies, which is related to expectations, right? So are you competent at getting things done, which kind of gets at the idea of locus of control, right? So not just, I expect things to work out, which would be general expectancies, but I can make this work out. So all of these things and other probably influences as well will affect that relationship between stimulus and response. So something happens, somebody insults you, somebody compliments you, you win the lottery, you stub your toe, whatever. How you respond, how you act in response to that incoming stimulus depends on some combination of all these things, right? And what affects all these things? Well, that's a question for another time. But it's enough for now just to kind of try to think about all the different cognitive processes that can potentially influence a given behavior. And again, the amount of variability that we're going to see in behaviors for any particular stimulus depends sometimes on the stimulus, right? If somebody pulls a gun on you and tells you to give me your wallet, there's probably a restricted range of behaviors we expect to see, despite whatever you're thinking. Most people will probably, give them the wallet. Some people might fight. Probably not going to break into a song and dance, or start laughing. Right? There's probably sometimes the power of the situation is such that it limits the number of possible behaviors, despite whatever's going to go on cognitively within individuals. Other times, there's a bit more room to see this kind of variability, right? Where, okay, if somebody calls and says, "Hey, you want to go see a movie or do something else?" Okay, well, there are all kinds of different behaviors that a person could choose in response to that stimulus that are going to depend on all these cognitive things that are going on inside their own heads, their own minds. Okay. Another kind of idea about kind of the things going on inside the black box would be this idea of schema or schemas. Schemas are cognitive structures for organizing information. So again, another way to think about personal constructs is they're a type of schema. Right? Schema is kind of a very broad term for cognitive structure. So you have schema that are personal constructs, but you also have schema that tell you, what to expect when you go to the bank, when you go shopping. They're kind of sets of pieces of information that are organized in such a way that they're easily accessible and they guide your behavior often in a fairly automatic fashion. we'll talk about in a second. Schema related to our personal experience, because our schema become more complex when more schema relevant information is encountered. Okay. So what I mean by that is, your schema for what to do when taking an exam. As a student, you've probably taken lots of exams. You've had lots of experience relevant to your exam schema. So it's a fairly complex schema, and you kind of know what to do, and you know all kinds of different variations. Okay, if it's paper and pencil versus online, if it's multiple choice or true false or essay, you kind of have all these different things that there's these different parameters and different types of behaviors that are expected. You know how to take tests, right? Probably more well developed than your schema for flying a plane. Unless, of course, you're a pilot. Most of us have some schema for flying a plane. It's like, there's a wheel, and you want to keep it straight, and maybe there's something you pull back to go up and push forward to go down. But that's about it for us. Our test schema is better than the plane schema. A pilot will have a very complex schema for flying, and there's a lot more detail rich in that and all these different variations. So our schema respond to experience, and then they can guide experience in terms of the automaticity of our behavior, automatic processing. So the more well-developed a schema is, it allows for greater automaticity. The more we do so, the more experience we have. Because the cognitive structure is rich in complexity, we can act with less effortful thinking. It's more automatic thinking. If you can remember when you're first learning to drive, and you remember if you're like me, you got the wheel and you're looking in the mirror, and you're okay. I got my foot on the gas. It's kind of pushing down this far, and you kind of know how much tense your muscles are, and too much. Okay, a little bit. Okay, look in the thing, and where are the other cars? Okay, my side mirror, rear view mirror, straight ahead, rear view mirror, straight ahead. Where's the gas again? Okay, yeah, and the radio. I can't turn it on right now. There's all kinds of stuff that you're paying attention to. And it's all taking a lot of cognitive effort. You're probably not carrying a lot of conversations, hopefully not talking on the phone or texting. But now, if you've been driving for a while, maybe you are talking on the phone or texting, or like some people I've talked to, reading the newspaper, because all these other things have become so automatic, right? Your schema has become complex and rich, so that doesn't take much thinking to drive, especially driving to some place that you go all the time, like work or school. You can pay attention to other things, and sometimes that'll get you in trouble. It's the weekend, and you leave your home and you start driving towards work, and you go, you're halfway there, and before you realize, oh wait, I was supposed to go to the store, but you got that automatic. You're in that automatic mode because the schema is so entrenched. Your body knows and your brain knows what it's doing, even when you're not paying attention. Okay. So one of the reasons I wanted to talk a little about schemas, is that for personality, it's important to talk about the schema that are related to the self. They're of particular interest to personality theorists. And so we'll talk about your self schemas, right? So self schema is a cognitive structure for processing information related to self-concept, related to how you see yourself. And it's obviously interesting for personality researchers and interesting for just kind of cognitive psychologists in general, including those that study memory, because the self schema seems to be one of the ones that influences our behavior the most and takes up a lot of our cognitive resources. You've heard about the cocktail party effect phenomenon, where you may be at a party in conversation with somebody, and there's lots of noise and music and chatter, and then through all this cacophony of noise, you hear your name from across the room, and you turn and look. Is somebody talking about me? Right? Because it's relevant to your self-concept. You're hearing everything, but you're only paying attention to maybe what somebody in front of you is talking, and you're following the conversation just fine. Nonetheless, you pick out your name amongst all the other hundreds or thousands of words and sounds that are in that environment. So the self schema is powerful determinant of behavior. So what are self schemas? Well, it's a self description, right? So it's how you see yourself, intelligent or unintelligent, loving, and also in relation to others. You're a son or a daughter, a mother or a father, American or European. Kind of what you like. Oh, you're a beer snob. You're a bibliophile. All these different things about yourself, physical, psychological, social descriptors, feed into your self schema. Right? But it's not every single piece of information relevant to you. If you're a lousy pole vaulter, at least you think you'd be a lousy pole vaulter, probably not part of your self schema if it's not relevant to you. So your self schema are your self descriptions that are personally relevant. So there's all kinds of information about you, some of which you could care less about. And if you don't care about it, it's not part of your self schema. It may be part of somebody else's schema for you. People may see you and they go, "Oh yeah, you're that tall dude," right? But you may not see yourself as a tall person or a short person. If it's not personally relevant to you, you don't even think about yourself being that way, even though it may be part of somebody else's schema for you. So it's personally relevant information, and it's related to behavior, right? We tend to be a strong relationship between our self schema, how we see ourselves, and how we behave, right? And lots of theories about that, and one of which is that in many ways we observe our own behavior, and that's how we develop our self schemas. Okay, I notice that I always do this. This is what I'm like. But it goes both ways too. Once we have an idea of what we're like, we like to behave consistently with that. And if our behavior and our self-concept are discrepant, we might experience anxiety, right? We might experience dissonance. And there's a whole big theory of taking social psych, Leon Festinger's cognitive dissonance theory, that addresses this idea. So if you see yourself as a giving person, but you're driving along and you're stopped at a stoplight and somebody on the street asks you for money and taps on your window, and you just look straight ahead. Now that wasn't consistent with your self-concept as this giving person, right? So if that happens, you're likely to experience anxiety. Again, if being giving is personally relevant for you and it's something that you value as part of yourself, right? So you've got to do something to deal with that dissonance, that anxiety. So you're either going to change your behavior, you're either going to give money to that person, or maybe to the next person you see, or you might reframe the situation. Oh, they were probably just going to use that money to buy beer anyway, right? But you have to do something to get rid of that feeling, that dissonance. So we like to be consistent. We like our behavior to be consistent with how we see ourselves, especially whenever it's ways that we see ourselves in a positive light. But to some extent, even the negative ways we see ourselves, we like consistency. Another idea related to kind of schema related to the self would be this idea of possible selves. We may aspire to become more or less of something in the future, right? Which is kind of related to the goals and values we talked about earlier. Hope to be a parent one day. I want to be a doctor or a lawyer, or I want to be sober, right? Some kind of future self. And I think I could be this. And you have this idea sometimes of how you could be, right? And having these possible selves seems to serve a couple of goals here. One, to serve as provide incentives for behavior, right? If I can see myself as this kind of future professional, then that's going to motivate me to study, right? Because I see a connection between studying and being a professional. But it also kind of gives meaning to events, kind of lets us know whether certain things are significant or not. If you get a DWI, if your future self involves somebody having a job in politics, well, that's a big deal. If your future self involves working at the carnival, then you get the DWI, probably not as big a deal. Not many background checks done for carnival workers, in my brief experience. So we have these possible selves, which is kind of what we aspire to. But then we also talk about the idea of self-discrepancies, which is a little different. And this is reflects a recognition that there's often a difference between how we see ourselves currently and other conceptualizations of ourselves that we may desire in the present. So how else we could be how we want to be now. It's not, well, one day I want to be this, but right now I want to be or should be different, not in the future. So instead of, one day I'd like to be an astronaut, that's kind of your possible self. Or one day I hope to be an astronaut. It's right now I should be an astronaut. That's kind of when we talk about self-discrepancies. So the things that might be discrepant, we start off with the idea that you have an actual self. So how you see yourself, all the information you have related to yourself, self-concept. And then you have an ideal self, which is how you would like to be, or I really want to be more patient. I want to be more understanding. I want to be on time more often. Right? These are kind of wants. But there's this other self, which is related to the ideal self, but different in an important way. This is the ought self, right? How you should be based on your perceptions of duties or obligations. Like, and it may be kind of the same characteristics. Like, I ought to be, I should be on time more often. There's a huge difference in that I want to be and I should be, which I'll talk about in just a second. But just to step back for a second, this is for the ought to be. So kind of these rules for how you should be based on duties or obligations. So it's like kind of what society expects of you, at least what you think society expects of you. Think back. This is going back a ways now to Freudian theory. What does this sound like in Freudian theory? Does it sound like kind of like ego stuff, id stuff, or superego? What part of the mind would be telling you what you should do? Okay, just kind of want to point out that it's possible to make connections here across fairly disparate theories. Okay, but again, it's important. This ideal self and ought self are important, are different in an important way, and the difference is in your emotional response to when your actual self is discrepant from one of these two. When your actual self and your ideal self are discrepant, you tend to feel sad. It's like, oh, I really liked this, and I just wasn't. I really want to be more dependable, but I wasn't able to be there at that time for that person. That sucks, right? You feel bad, and usually that serves as a motivation to try harder next time. It's like, oh, I feel bad. I want to do it better next time. The ought self, if I should be, I ought to be more dependable, and I wasn't. That's a different feeling. Now it's a feeling of more kind of anxiety and guilt. And for many people, it doesn't serve as motivation then to try to do that in the future, because the anxiety gets in the way of performance. It's not performance enhancing anxiety; it's performance deterring anxiety, which is relevant for any of you that want to do therapy. Oftentimes we talk about helping people to get away from shoulding all over themselves. You don't try not to live by the shoulds, because there are no rules for what you should do, merely what you would like to do and what you wouldn't like to do. And there are very few rules about what you should do, other than you shouldn't kill people. Beyond that, there's not a whole lot of rules. Which brings us to discussion of one of the applications of cognitive theory. Cognitive behavioral therapy. One branch of which, there are lots of different types of CBT, some of which they call themselves cognitive therapists, but usually there's some behavioral components, so I'll just call them all CBT. One flavor would be rational emotive therapy, Albert Ellis's approach, which, depending on which of his books or articles you're reading, I'll refer to it as rational emotive therapy or rational emotive behavior therapy. But in terms of the cognitive component, it talks about this kind of ABC sequence, right? Where something happens and you feel a certain way. So when something happens, he talks about it being A, that's the activating event. And then there's an emotional consequence. So you get fired and you feel, let's say, ashamed, deeply ashamed. So why do you feel ashamed? Well, I feel ashamed because I got fired. And else would go, no, you idiot, because he was fairly confrontational. But I wouldn't recommend doing that, but he did it. No, you're missing a step, and the missing step is the B, right? You're from A to C without the B. Something happening can't make you feel a certain way, right? Because somebody else might have gotten fired and they wouldn't have felt that way. And why not? Well, because it depends on your belief system. And he says that if you got fired and you feel deeply ashamed, if it's an emotional level of the level of emotion is inappropriate, which is up to the clinician usually to judge if something's inappropriate, then there must be some irrational belief that's moderating that relationship. So tell me, whenever you got fired, what did you think? Oh, I felt ashamed. I know what you felt. What did you think? Well, I thought, I don't know. I thought, oh, I can't believe I got fired. I'm not going to be able to support my family. I should be able to support them and not make mistakes like this. He said, okay, let's stop. So if you get fired, then you've failed your family and you can't ever support them, right? And you should always be perfect, and you should never fail at anything. Is that what you're saying? Well, no, sort of. But because if you think that, then it makes sense to be ashamed. Yeah, that, and not just that you shouldn't ever fail them, but failing them means that you're less of a person. You're less of a man. Yeah, I can see that. Yeah, that makes sense to feel ashamed if you feel like getting fired means that you're less of a man. It makes perfect sense to feel that way. Now let's go back and look at that thought. Right? Is that rational, that getting fired from this one job means that you're suddenly less of a person, have less value? If not, if it doesn't make sense, then it's irrational. It's an irrational belief, and we need to change the way you're thinking about it. And if you can change the way you're thinking about it, you'll feel differently about it. Again, and with the whole point of that being not just to make people feel good, but to help them avoid those emotional consequences that don't lead to better behavior, don't lead to adaptive behavior. Because the emotional consequences of irrational beliefs are typically emotional responses that don't lead to doing something to fix the problem. They're kind of debilitating emotions because they can't motivate us to do better, because often they involve feelings of worthlessness. CBT often might address things like cognitive distortions, just getting at the idea that in addition to these core beliefs people might have that are irrational about themselves and what they should do and how they should be in the world, which is what Ellis focused on. So some of these schema, some of these rational beliefs are probably schema about their place in the world and what certain things mean. Cognitive distortions are other schema about more about styles of processing information, ways of thinking about information that aren't logical. And again, anything that's not logical is thought to be distorted thinking, so not true thinking. Examples might be black and white thinking, with the assumption being that very few things in the world are clearly black and white, are clearly either or. Most things are shades of gray. They're gradations. So if somebody's in a relationship and they think, oh, I'm not sure if they love me, and if they don't love me, then they hate me. What? No, hopefully that doesn't make sense. But it's a way of thinking, and it's not uncommon in people that suffer from depression to have that kind of thinking, that it's either this or this, and there's no in between. So either I'm doing a great job, or I'm failing, and there's no in between. Okay. Personalization is a tendency to it's kind of like self-referential thinking. It's a tendency to take things that are potentially neutral, potentially not about you, and make them be about you. An example I always use is you see a friend walking down the street across the road from you on a sidewalk, and you wave, and they don't wave back. And personalization would be, they didn't wave because they hate me because I'm an idiot and I'm stupid. And why did I even wave in the first place? Why did I think they were my friend? I'm such a dork. Versus somebody who's thinking logically and more flexible, think, I wonder if they saw me. I don't think they did. And if they did, I wonder why they didn't wave. I guess they're distracted. Right? So there's all these different possible explanations for their behavior other than just something about me. But if you have a cognitive distortion, you might think it's just something about you. And one more example, there's several. It would be catastrophization or catastrophizing. And this is whenever usually one level of failure is experienced. So something bad happens. And then going down, kind of setting up these like dominoes in your mind, tipping over from this one bad thing to something much, much worse, this catastrophe happening. So somebody gets a flat tire, and they go, oh my god, a flat tire, I can't believe I got a flat tire, and I'm going to be late to work, and the boss is probably going to be mad at me, and they're going to fire me, and I don't know if I have money for this flat tire, and so I'm probably going to write a hot check, and then I won't be able to pay the rent, and then I'm kicked out of my house in a hot check. I'll probably get picked up on a warrant for that, end up in jail, and be homeless and destitute, unless, at least in jail maybe they'll feed me. It'll probably be bad food. So again, from a flat tire to this really horrible consequence, where somebody's lost their job and their house and or is sitting in jail. That would be an example of catastrophization. So CBT therapists try to help clients identify those and then also counter them. Another thing that they work on a lot are automatic negative thoughts. This is sometimes somewhat related to the irrational belief that Ellis talks about. In terms of, for Ellis, the irrational belief is usually not conscious, and not that it's in your some sort of unconscious like the id in terms of psychodynamics. Just you're not currently aware of it. You're not thinking about it, and that when kind of challenged on it, you might be able to identify. Yeah, I guess I kind of do think that way, but you won't kind of go through life knowing that. Okay, yeah, I do assume that I should be perfect in every way, and if I'm not, I'm not lovable. Right? But you also don't have to do free association to figure that out. So you're not aware of it in your every waking moment, but it's not in kind of some unconscious that you're actively repressing. Related to that, cognitive therapists and cognitive behavioral therapists often assume that one thing that contributes to psychopathology and to negative moods in particular are these automatic negative thoughts. Some of which are kind of a self-destructive thought and self-destructive talk. When you kind of tell yourself negative things, but it's automatic. So you're not. It doesn't take any effort, right? So it's a fairly complex, rich schema of negativity, of pessimism, so that when something happens, you very quickly will think, okay, it's not going to work out. It's never going to work out. Or it's all my fault, or I'm going to screw it up. And again, not that you have to kind of think, okay, am I going to do it? Okay, am I not? Oh no, I think I'm going to screw up. But automatically, very quickly, these negative thoughts come to mind for some people, more so than others. And when you're in a depressed mood, more likely to have these type of thoughts. And again, at almost a subliminal level. Again, don't want to kind of go and say, well, it's at this unconscious level, but we're not fully aware that we think these things. But if you're kind of given, a homework assignment, told, okay, I want you to journal when anything bad happens, write down, stop and pay attention to what you're thinking. People can usually say, okay, well, I was thinking this. I never stopped to realize that I thought that before, because it happens so quickly. You think it so quickly, and then you feel bad, and all that you pay attention to is the feeling bad and whatever happened, right? They said, I called my girlfriend, my boyfriend, they said they couldn't go out, and I felt angry and sad, and all these things. And you got to back up and say, okay, well, right before you felt angry and sad, what did you think? And if you slow people down, they can usually identify those things. But if you don't, all they know is, well, I felt angry and sad because they said they couldn't go out. So you're working on identifying these automatic negative thoughts and also challenging those. And then kind of the broad setting for all of this, for cognitive behavioral therapy, is this idea of collaborative empiricism. which is consistent with the way that cognitive theorists think about individuals. That we're all, these little scientists, little walking empiricists, that we're gathering information and testing things. But that the job of a cognitive behavioral therapist is to be a fellow empiricist with you, so to collaborate with you to try to figure out what's going on, and to work together to say, okay, well, I wonder. Here's a hypothesis. I wonder if you're feeling this way because you're thinking these thoughts. How can we figure out if that's what's going on? Well, we could try an experiment where you try thinking differently. You try telling yourself this message instead of this one in those situations, and see if you feel any different. And then, kind of together, let's find out. So it's not I'm going to run you through this maze like a rat, but working together to say, well, I don't know, is this? What do you think? Coming up with hypotheses together, coming up with assignments together, and then processing it in a collaborative atmosphere. That also obviously involves other relationship variables as well. Okay, another kind of application of the cognitive theory would be the repertory grid technique, which is a way of getting at those personal constructs, which I've never been trained on. No place I've ever worked has used it. The book makes it sound like it's very common in clinical work, but not in my experience. Nonetheless, I'll kind of just talk about it a little bit. As you probably read, you make a list of individuals and then they group them 3 at a time. Say, okay, for these people, how are they different? And there's different variations of it. Okay, sometimes you put 2 people on the list and then yourself. So, okay, how are 2 of these people different from one of the other persons? And based on this, people are going to come up with, okay, well, this person's honest and this person's dishonest. The idea is that what you're using to make discriminations between or among these individuals are your personal constructs. And that once you do enough of these, you can get a good idea. How much are enough? Well, depends on how good you are and how verbally fluent the client is. So it sounds like an interesting technique, but some obvious problems with it too, in terms of no real standardization of how to do it, or in terms of a normative comparison sample, in terms of how to make sense of it. Like, what words do you look for? Do you not look for? How many words are enough? If somebody says gregarious versus shy, and this person is extroverted versus introverted, are those 2 different personal constructs or the same personal construct? There are no real rules for how to make sense of that. So if you're kind of well versed in personality theory, might be helpful for other folks. Probably not so much. Okay, so let's take a look at this approach overall, the good and the bad. Good, empirical basis, right? So unlike some of the early theories we talked about in this course, even though Kelly is featured prominently in this chapter, the cognitive approach isn't based on one individual's view of the world. And you can't read this stuff and go, oh yeah, I can kind of see how this person's the way their father treated them and what happened with their mom. It makes sense that this is their theory, right? There's none of that. It seems to be much more an outgrowth of research findings. So people have found these things about the way we think, and they've kind of cobbled together these ideas about the way that we think affects our behavior, right? And a pretty good amount of research on cognitive theories. Not as much as kind of pure behavioral stuff, but probably second place goes to cognitive. Therapeutic efficacy. The therapies based on theory work really well, especially for some disorders, some of the mood disorders, depression, and also some of the anxiety disorders respond pretty well to cognitive approaches. In terms of negatives, some of the concepts aren't well defined. Like the personal construct, even Kelly said that some personal constructs. We talked about what are examples? Outgoing versus shy. Okay. I get that, but he said some of the personal constructs defy description within the limits of our language. So some of these constructs that people are using that are bipolar, there are no real words to describe what it is they're doing. And if there aren't words to describe it, then it's really hard to talk about it or to study it. And so it's hard to know exactly what he's talking about in terms of these subverbal personal constructs. So again, because these aren't observable behaviors, when we talk about these schema, these cognitive structures, which are hypothetical things, that's a little bit more loosey-goosey than straightforward observable behaviors. Another weakness of the approach is that there isn't kind of a grand unifying theory that organizes all the different aspects of the cognitive approach into a whole, that clearly delineates how the parts relate to each other. Right. So, if you want to know, well, how do self-discrepancies influence how you think about others when using your personal constructs? We don't know. There's no big theory that says, okay, well, this relates to this, which relates to this. It's largely, some people did research here, some people did research here, and it's all related to how we think about stimuli before generating a response. But there's not one big theory that kind of puts it all together. And related to that, the mechanisms of development aren't all that clear. There's no concrete explanation for how people develop different personal constructs or different schema. What's the relationship between these things and genetics or brain structure? And there is some stuff which we didn't get to talk about in terms of schema and brain structure or neural networks, but that's still kind of a young field. But we don't have real good explanations for, okay, well, people all process information differently. How does that happen? What's the mechanism by which some people attend to this thing? Some people notice the music, and some people notice the food. Why? Is it just early experiences, and then what experience is it? Because somebody had. Is it what you have positive experiences with first that influences what you notice, or strength of experience, or what is it? And there aren't clear answers for those questions. Again, because there's not this kind of grand unifying theory. Nonetheless, it is an important approach to keep in mind, and addresses some of those things that are just ignored by the behaviorists, and say, okay, here's a stimulus, here's a response. In between, there's some stuff which isn't scientific, so we're not going to talk about it. And the cognitive theorists say, well, it's hard to talk about it. It's complicated, but let's try. And they found some really interesting stuff and found that they can study these things and found some evidence for these ideas like having a schema, and that they do influence behavior and can be used to predict behavior. So some support for the theory, but like most of the others, it's not perfect. And to have a really complete understanding of human personality, you probably need to be able to think a little bit from the perspective of each of the theories we've discussed. None of them is completely right, none is completely wrong. All offer a slightly different view on the human experience, on personality, and each of them are valuable in some way. Okay, that's all for now. Take care.